That cold morning, no one expected an act of kindness to change everything. What started as another day in the city became a story the whole town tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here we show that even behind power and fear, there are still human hearts. Vito Carmine ruled the city through fear, control, and an iron will that bent every man around him. His restaurants, his streets, his code. For 30 years he lived by one principle: show weakness, lose everything. But his daughter, Isabella, had stopped eating. Not a diet, a dissolution. Her bones became visible through silk dresses, her eyes sank, her voice turned to whisper, and Vito, who could command armies of men with a glance, stood helpless in his own home. The doctors offered explanations: anorexia nervosa, psychological trauma, control mechanism, perfectionism. But Vito knew the truth. It was guilt. His guilt. The weight of his world had crushed her, and she was disappearing to escape it. One wet November evening, desperate and silent, Vito walked into a small diner on 5th Street. Not his diner. Somewhere anonymous. Somewhere he could sit in the back booth and watch the rain hammer against the windows without being recognized. He sat there for hours, nursing cold coffee, watching the waitress, Sarah, move through the diner with quiet efficiency. She had kind eyes, the type that notice things, the type that see people. Sarah noticed him. She noticed everything. The expensive wool coat draped over a frame, carrying invisible weight. The trembling hands, the way his eyes followed families eating together, his jaw clenching with each bite they took. That night, Vito made a decision that would unmake him entirely. Chapter 1. The Weight of Hunger. The penthouse was silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. A sound that had once meant order, punctuality, control. Now it only meant the passage of time that Vito couldn't fill with anything meaningful. He sat at the head of the marble dining table, the same table where he had hosted business meetings, made decisions that shaped the city, enforced the codes that kept his empire intact. Now it felt like a tomb. Isabella entered slowly, as if each step required negotiation with her own body. She wore one of the silk dresses her mother had bought years ago. Clothing that once fit beautifully now hung like a costume from someone else's life. Her dark hair, which had always been her pride, was pulled back in a way that made her face appear skeletal. Vito had to look away. The meal was there. Pasta primavera, grilled chicken breast, fresh vegetables arranged with aesthetic precision by the private chef. The kind of meal that cost more than most families ate in a week. Isabella pulled out the chair across from her father and sat carefully, as if her body might shatter. "Eat," Vito said quietly, his voice carrying the tone he had used 1,000 times to command men, to bend situations to his will. Isabella picked up her fork. She cut a small piece of chicken into even smaller pieces. She looked at it on the tines of the fork as if it were something foreign, something that belonged in a laboratory rather than on a plate. The fork moved toward her mouth, hovered there, trembled slightly, then retreated. "I'm not hungry," she whispered, eyes fixed on the plate as if the food might attack her if she looked away long enough. Vito felt something crack inside his chest, a sound only he could hear, a fault line running through the infrastructure of his entire identity. He had spent 30 years learning that emotion was weakness, that vulnerability was a weapon waiting to be used against you. He had taught himself to bury feeling beneath layers of calculation and control. But watching his daughter refuse food wasn't a business problem he could solve. It was evidence of his complete and total failure. He had seen men waste away in prison. He had watched enemies shrivel from fear and desperation. He had learned long ago that the body is the first thing to surrender when the spirit breaks. He had understood it as a tool then, a way to break people. Now he understood it as a language his own daughter was speaking, and he had no vocabulary to respond. Isabella. His voice was gentler this time, though it still carried the weight of all the years he had spent terrifying people into obedience. You must eat. You need your strength. She looked up at him, and he saw himself in her face, the same sharp cheekbones, the same dark eyes that had intimidated hundreds of men. But where his carried the hardness of 1,000 betrayals and calculated cruelties, hers carried confusion and pain and something that looked like apology. "I can't, Papa," she said quietly. "I can't explain why, I just can't." The fork clattered from her thin fingers onto the plate, a sound that echoed through the vast dining room like a gunshot. She rose slowly, unsteadily, gripping the edge of the table for balance, as if she might lose her gravity at any moment. Her legs moved mechanically, without the confidence of youth, without the ease of health. She walked from the dining room, leaving behind untouched food and the weight of Vito's helplessness. He remained at the table, surrounded by expensive uneaten meals, his empire suddenly rendered worthless. He could not command her to live. He could not force her back into the world with fear or threats or money. She was slipping away in a way that no business strategy could address, no amount of power could prevent. And the powerlessness was suffocating. Vito reached for the wineglass. His hands trembled. The man who had orchestrated the fall of rival families, who had ordered men to disappear without trace, whose word was law in a city of millions, was trembling over wine. Later that night, Vito stood in her doorway. Isabella lay in bed, her frame barely visible beneath the silk sheets. The room was dark, except for the ambient light from the city beyond the windows. In the darkness, he could hear her breathing, shallow, exhausted, carrying the sound of someone fighting against their own body. He wanted to speak. He wanted to say something that would fix this, transform it, make it stop, but all he had were the words of a man accustomed to dominance. And those words were useless here. They were weapons designed for a different kind of war. He closed the door quietly and walked through the penthouse like a ghost, haunting his own life. The rooms that had once felt like monuments to his success now felt like mausoleums. Glass and steel and carefully curated art. Nothing lived here, nothing breathed. Everything was preserved, displayed, controlled. The rain had begun to fall outside, streaking the floor-to-ceiling windows with silver. Vito poured himself a drink, something expensive, something that had cost more than the average person's monthly salary. And it tasted like nothing. The alcohol provided no warmth, no comfort, no escape. He sat in darkness, watching the city lights blur in the wet glass. Somewhere out there were families eating together, laughing, fighting over nothing, taking for granted the ordinary miracle of sharing a meal. Somewhere, daughters were laughing at their fathers' jokes. Somewhere, fathers weren't destroying their own children simply by existing. He had built this empire on the principle that control equals safety, that fear keeps people in line, that vulnerability is a weapon waiting to be used against you. His father had taught him this in a childhood filled with violence and abandonment. His first years in business had reinforced it. Every successful threat, every man he had intimidated into submission, every rival he had destroyed, they all confirmed the same principle. But Isabella's silence was teaching him something else. That control is an illusion, and fear cannot save the people you love most. It can only transform them into versions of themselves hollowed out by terror. It can only teach them that the world is dangerous, that their bodies are prisons, that the only safety lies in disappearance. By 3 a.m, Vito had made a decision that would reshape everything. He would leave the penthouse. He would walk into the anonymous rain and find a place where no one knew his name, where he could sit in a corner booth and remember what it felt like to be helpless. Perhaps in that helplessness, he would find something that 30 years of power had stolen from him. Perhaps he would find his daughter again before she disappeared entirely. He had no idea that a waitress named Sarah was about to teach him the meaning of grace. Chapter 2. The Diner. The rain continued through the night and into the following week, a persistent reminder that the world operated by forces outside Vito's control. He found himself returning to the small diner on 5th Street with a rhythm that felt almost religious, a faith structured not around tradition, but around need. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, sometimes Wednesday if the wait at home became too much to bear. Always the back booth, the one in the corner where he could watch without being observed. Always cold coffee, because he never had the courage to order anything requiring the commitment of actually consuming it. The diner was called Maggie's, named after Maggie O'Brien, the original owner, who had passed the place to her nephew 20 years ago. Maggie had died of a stroke while standing behind the counter, and her nephew, Tim, had kept everything exactly as she had left it. The walls were lined with photographs, old couples on their wedding days, their faces lit with a joy that suggested they believed happiness was permanent. Children at Christmas morning half asleep with wonder, men in uniform before they went to war, their eyes still carrying the belief that they would return. It was a place where time moved differently, slower, kinder, more honest than the world outside. The coffee was always hot, the pie was always fresh. The people who worked there seemed to understand that a diner is not just a restaurant, it's a shelter. It's a place where broken things come to be quietly held. Sarah began to recognize him. Not his name, she never asked. Not his world. She seemed to exist outside the reach of the city's underworld, untouched by its violence and cruelty, just his presence. She noticed how he never ordered food, only coffee, how his eyes tracked families with an intensity that bordered on ache, how he watched a father help his young daughter cut her meat, how he watched a mother wipe her son's mouth with a napkin, how he gripped the coffee cup like it was the only solid thing in a world of dissolution. She noticed his hands. They were expensive hands, manicured, unmarked by manual labor, but they trembled. The tremor was subtle, the kind that might go unnoticed by most people. But Sarah had learned to see the things people tried to hide. She had learned it the hard way. On his 4th visit, a Thursday evening when the diner was between the lunch crowd and dinner rush, Sarah brought him soup, not coffee, soup. A simple bowl of minestrone, steam rising from the surface in delicate spirals, carrying the smell of vegetables and broth and something that tasted like care. She set it down gently in front of him. "On the house," she said quietly. "You look like you haven't eaten." Vito wanted to refuse. The habit of control demanded it. The persona he had constructed demanded it. But something in her eyes, that same kindness he had noticed before, but now directed at him, now offering him something instead of asking him for anything, made him lift the spoon instead. The soup was warm. It was real. It was the first thing he had tasted in weeks that didn't turn to ash in his mouth. He moved slowly, methodically, as if the simple act of eating had become a meditation. "Thank you," he said when the bowl was empty, the gesture feeling monumental in its ordinariness. "You're welcome," Sarah replied, and then without judgment or prying, without the clinical tone of a therapist or the concern of a social worker, she said, "It's hard when the people you love stop taking care of themselves, isn't it?" Vito looked up at her. She was not asking for information. She was not demanding that he confess his pain or justify his presence. She was simply offering recognition, understanding. She was saying, "I see your pain, and it's not shameful. I see your helplessness, and it doesn't diminish you. I see you, and you are not alone." He nodded. It was all he could manage. "Would you like more soup?" she asked. "Yes," he said, and he meant yes to more than soup. Yes to this moment, yes to being seen, yes to the possibility that things could be different. That night, returning home in the rain, Vito found Isabella in the kitchen. She was standing by the window, looking out at the city lights blurred by precipitation. Her silhouette was impossibly thin against the brightness beyond, like a cutout, like a ghost already halfway to disappearing. Her hands were wrapped around a mug of tea that she wasn't drinking. "I went to a diner tonight," Vito said quietly, removing his coat. The words felt fragile, like they might break if he spoke too firmly. Isabella turned to look at him. She didn't speak, just waited. "The waitress brought me soup," he continued, choosing each word as if arranging flowers in a vase. "I didn't ask for it. She just brought it, like she knew I needed it, like she could see that I wasn't taking care of myself." Isabella's eyes filled with tears. They spilled over before she could stop them, running down her hollow cheeks like rainfall. Vito realized in that moment that she needed something different from him, not commands, not control, not the weight of his expectation crushing her beneath its gravity. She needed to be seen, the way that waitress had seen him, without judgment, without demand, simply with the quiet recognition that he too was struggling, that he too was disappearing. "I'm sorry," Vito said, and the words opened something inside him that had been sealed shut for 30 years. Chapter 3. Small Gestures. The following Saturday, Vito prepared himself as if going into battle. He showered, shaved, wore clothing that was expensive but not threatening, attempting to become someone his daughter could trust, someone safe. He knocked on Isabella's door. "I'd like you to meet someone," he said simply. He didn't announce it with fanfare. He didn't demand her compliance. He simply offered an invitation, and to his surprise, Isabella accepted. They drove through the rain in silence. Vito gripped the steering wheel as if it might save him. Isabella looked out the window at the city passing by, a city she had grown up in but now seemed like a foreign country. When they entered the diner, Sarah was working the morning shift. She saw them enter, the thin girl with dark eyes that held too much knowledge of pain, and the man who had become a regular, a ghost in an expensive coat who nursed cold coffee and carried invisible weight. She didn't greet them with cheerfulness or forced enthusiasm. Professional servers often make that mistake. They believe that brightness can chase away darkness. But Sarah understood something deeper. She understood that sometimes what broken people need is permission to be broken in peace. She approached their booth with the kind of presence that said, "You're welcome here, exactly as you are. Healing is not required for entry." "Coffee?" she asked Vito, her tone warm but ordinary. Then, looking at Isabella with eyes that held genuine curiosity rather than clinical concern, "What can I get for you?" Isabella froze. The question that had become her enemy everywhere else, at home, at doctors' offices, in the privacy of her own mind where she fought battles no one could see, somehow felt different in this small diner, different in the mouth of this woman who asked without demanding, who looked without judging. "Just water," Isabella whispered, her voice barely above breath. "Of course," Sarah said. She paused, and Vito realized she was considering something, making a decision. "And I just made pancakes this morning. Would you like me to bring a small plate? No pressure, just in case you change your mind later." She said it like it was an afterthought, like it was nothing, like she was simply offering a possibility, not a demand, like a parent offering a child a choice, rather than forcing obedience. Isabella nodded. When Sarah returned with the plate and the water, something shifted in the choreography of the moment. She set down the items, and then this was the gesture that would echo through everything that followed, that would reshape the trajectory of 3 lives. She sat down across from them, just for a moment, not hovering, not performing, just sitting. "My sister struggled with eating too," Sarah said quietly to Isabella, her voice carrying the weight of genuine experience. "Not the same, but she couldn't. And I learned that sometimes the problem isn't the food. Sometimes it's the feeling that the world is too heavy to digest." She paused, letting her hands rest on the table. "I never wanted her to eat for me. I just wanted her to know that someone understood, that the struggle was real, that she wasn't crazy for feeling the weight." Sarah stood and walked away, leaving the plate and the words behind like seeds planted in soil. Isabella looked at the pancakes. For the first time in months, something in her expression shifted. It wasn't hunger, not yet. It was recognition. Someone had seen her, not as a problem to be solved, not as a disappointment to be fixed, but as a person carrying too much. Someone had looked at her, and instead of seeing what was wrong, had seen what was happening beneath the surface. She cut a small piece of pancake, and she ate it. Vito watched his daughter eat, and his eyes filled with tears. The first tears he had allowed himself in 30 years. The first time he had permitted himself to show weakness in front of another person. The transformation wasn't instant, it wasn't miraculous, but it had begun. And it began not with his power, but with his powerlessness. It began when he admitted that he couldn't fix this alone and allowed a stranger to show him what compassion looks like. Over the following hour, Isabella ate half the plate. She drank the water. She spoke, in whispers, to Sarah about things she had never told her father. Sarah listened, asked gentle questions, didn't try to fix anything. And Vito, sitting in the booth, understood that he had been approaching love entirely wrong. Love isn't about solving. Love is about presence. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of redemption and courage can travel. Chapter 4. The Conversation. Over the following weeks, Isabella returned to the diner with the kind of regularity that began to resemble healing. Sarah was always there, always present, never pushing, never demanding. The girl who had been disappearing began to reappear, not suddenly, not completely, but in small, incremental ways that felt like watching a Polaroid photograph develop in real time. They began to talk, quietly in corners of the diner during the lull between breakfast and lunch, over hot chocolate served in mismatched mugs and small portions of pie that became slightly larger portions with each visit. Sarah spoke about her sister with a tenderness that suggested she had paid the price for that tenderness in grief. She stopped eating when our father left. Sarah explained one afternoon. She was 12. She thought if she disappeared, maybe he would come back. Maybe he would realize what he was losing. Sarah's hands wrapped around her own mug, seeking warmth. Of course, that's not how it worked. He never came back. But she lost 8 years of her life fighting her own body before she realized the truth. What truth? Isabella asked quietly. That disappearing doesn't make people come back. It only makes them come looking for a ghost instead of a person. Sarah looked at Isabella directly. Your father isn't going anywhere. He's already here, already changed. He's just terrified he can't undo what he did. Isabella began to talk for the first time about the weight she had been carrying, about growing up in a world built on fear and control, about loving her father desperately and hating what his world had made him, about believing, somewhere deep in her broken reasoning, that if she disappeared, perhaps he would too. Perhaps they could both escape the gravity of his empire. He's not a bad man, Isabella said one afternoon, her voice thin as paper, but gaining substance with each word. That's what makes it worse. He's not evil, he's just trapped. And I was trapped in his trap, and the only way out I could see was to stop existing. Sarah listened. She didn't offer solutions drawn from psychology or self-help books. She didn't say that Vito was trying, or that things would get better, or any of the platitudes that bounce off pain without touching it. She simply listened, and in that listening, Isabella began to feel the weight on her shoulders shift, just slightly. Not disappear, but shift, redistributed, made more bearable. Your father comes here because of you, Sarah said one day. Did you know that? He sits in that booth and he watches families, and he grieves. Not just for what he's lost, but for what he's made you lose. He can't change, Isabella said with the certainty of someone who had lived inside control her entire life. His world doesn't allow change. His world requires power. Maybe, Sarah replied. Or maybe love is more powerful than empire. Maybe a daughter is stronger than a city. Maybe your father is already changing. You're just not looking at the right things. Isabella thought about her father sitting alone in the penthouse, staring at untouched plates, his face carrying the expression of someone watching everything he had built become meaningless. She thought about him returning night after night to a small diner where a waitress brought him soup without asking for anything in return. She thought about him bringing her here not as a command, but as a plea, and she began to understand that he was changing, not into a different man, but into a more human version of the man he had always been. The next time she returned home, Isabella found her father in the kitchen. He was cooking, badly, burning garlic, oversalting pasta, nearly setting a cloth on fire. But he was trying. She could see it in the concentration on his face, the care he was taking despite his obvious incompetence. "I thought," he said quietly, turning to face her, "we could eat together, nothing fancy, just together." They ate together that night. Not much, not without struggle, but together. And in that togetherness, something cracked open in the fortress that had surrounded them both, the walls that had been built to protect them, but had instead imprisoned them. Isabella took another bite, then another, and Vito understood that this wasn't about food. It was about trust. It was about believing for the first time in months that being alive was worth the effort. Chapter 5. The weight returns. But redemption is never a straight line. Transformation never comes without resistance. This is the truth that no salvation narrative wants to acknowledge. That healing is not linear. That progress can reverse. That hope can collapse under the weight of circumstance. 3 weeks into Isabella's small steps forward, just when Vito was beginning to believe that change was possible, his world caught up with him like a predator that had been waiting patiently in tall grass. A business rival, a man named Russo, who had been hungry and ruthless in the way Vito had taught an entire generation of men to be, made a move against him, an encroachment, a threat. A testing of the waters to see if Vito was still the man he had been. The men gathered in Vito's office on a Thursday morning, his second in command, Frankie, his enforcer, Tony, his accountant, Marcus. The structure of dominance, perfectly preserved, perfectly functional. They sat around the mahogany table where countless decisions had been made, countless fates had been sealed. "Russo is moving into the 5th Street territory," Frankie said flatly. "He's opened 3 new operations, numbers games, protection rackets, the whole portfolio. He's not testing, he's taking." The old Vito would have responded with immediate violence, with brutality that would echo through the city for years. He would have ordered Russo eliminated, would have made an example that would terrify any other man who might have similar ideas. This was how empires were maintained. This was the language his world spoke. But Vito was no longer entirely the old Vito. He was fractured now, existing in the space between 2 versions of himself, unable to fully commit to either. "We respond," Tony said, leaning forward. "We respond hard and we respond fast. We send a message." The men waited for Vito to speak. They were accustomed to his orders arriving like lightning, swift, absolute, devastating. But Vito sat in silence, his hands trembling slightly as he thought about Isabella. He thought about Sarah in the diner. He thought about the weight that violence carries, the way it doesn't just hurt the people it's aimed at, but ripples outward, infecting everyone it touches, poisoning the future before it even arrives. "No," he said quietly. His men stared at him as if he had begun speaking a foreign language. "No?" Frankie repeated, seeking clarification as if he had mishearing. We let it go, Vito continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. We absorb the loss and we move forward. We don't respond with violence. Boss, his second-in-command said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone stepping through a minefield. If we don't respond, everyone will think we're weak. They'll circle. They'll consume us. 6 months from now you won't have a city. You'll have nothing. Then we'll have nothing, Vito said, and he meant it. I won't sacrifice what I've rebuilt for the illusion of control. The men left without understanding. They had been taught by Vito himself that weakness is death. They had learned that hesitation is fatal. They didn't know that sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is refuse to play the game. That night, returning home, Vito found Isabella in her room. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, her body curled inward in a way that suggested collapse. The weight loss had returned. The food that she had been eating in increasing portions had stopped. She was reverting, regressing, disappearing again. What happened? He asked, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed, keeping distance between them as if proximity might scare her. I heard about the business deal, Isabella said quietly, not meeting his eyes. The men were talking. You let Russo take what was yours. You didn't fight. No, Vito replied. I chose not to destroy anyone over money. They'll come back, Isabella said, and her voice carried the weight of his own logic, the principles he had taught her inadvertently through his presence in her life. They'll see you as prey. You've made yourself vulnerable. Vito sat with his daughter in the darkness of her room, and he realized something profound and devastating. He had been trying so hard to change for her that he had forgotten to help her change too. She was still trapped in his old logic, still believing that love means control, still convinced that safety requires dominance. Isabella, he said slowly, measuring each word, the strongest thing I can do is refuse to play their game. The strongest thing I can be is a man who chooses integrity over empire. Not for them, for us, for you. He paused, gathering the courage to say something that required vulnerability he had never shown before. Your mother believed in grace, he continued. I never understood it. I thought grace was weakness. I thought forgiveness was surrender. But she tried to teach me, and I wasn't ready to listen. I was too busy building my walls. Isabella looked at him for the first time. But I'm ready now, he said. And I know that losing half my power doesn't diminish me. It expands me. It gives me room to breathe that I didn't know I was suffocating without. And then, after a long silence filled only with the sound of rain against the windows, I need you to eat, not because I command it, not because I'm trying to fix you, but because you deserve to live, because your life has value that has nothing to do with my power, my business, my world. You matter because you exist, not because you're useful, not because you're strong. You matter. Isabella wept. And when her tears had subsided, when the weight had shifted just slightly, she asked for soup. Chapter 6. The Turning Point. Sarah received a phone call late one evening. It was Vito. His voice was different from their conversations in the diner. Stripped of authority, carrying only vulnerability, the rawness of a man colliding with his own transformation. She could hear the tremor in his voice. She's eating, he said. Isabella is eating again. There was relief in his voice, but also something deeper, recognition, understanding that the miracle wasn't food or willpower or control. The miracle was connection. The miracle was being witnessed. I wanted to thank you, he continued, and she could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, could hear him gathering courage. I don't know how to say this. I've spent my life taking things, commanding things, breaking things, but I never understood how to give, how to simply be present, how to let someone matter more than power. You showed me that." Sarah listened, and her own eyes filled with tears. She thought about her sister, who had recovered slowly but completely. She thought about all the people who had come through the diner broken and had left with the small kindness of being seen. And she said something that would stay with him the rest of his life. "She's eating because she knows her father loves her more than he loves his power. That's the greatest gift a parent can give." After they hung up, Sarah stood in the diner for a long time after her shift ended. She stood behind the counter where Maggie had died, where so many people had found refuge, where kindness had been served alongside pie and coffee. She thought about the architecture of grace, how a single gesture of compassion can reshape the world, how one person's capacity to see another person can literally save lives. Isabella continued to recover, slowly, not in a straight line. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, conversations in the diner booth where she spiraled, and Sarah simply sat across from her and listened without trying to fix anything. There was an afternoon when Isabella refused to eat for an entire week. There was a night when Vito found her crying in the bathroom, terrified that she was failing, that she was sliding backward into the abyss. But underneath it all, something was healing. The girl who had been disappearing was beginning to reappear. Her face rounded slightly. Color returned to her cheeks. She enrolled in community college classes. She made friends who knew nothing of her father's empire, who valued her simply for who she was becoming, rather than who she had been born into being. One afternoon, as Isabella gained back the weight and color that her body had lost, as her voice grew stronger and her presence in the world became less ghost-like, Vito asked if he could do something that would have been unthinkable to him just months earlier. He approached Sarah after the lunch rush and asked in a voice barely above whisper, "Can I work here? Not as an owner, not as someone taking control, just as someone who washes dishes, someone who's part of something real." Sarah understood what he was asking. He wasn't asking for a job in the conventional sense. He was asking for redemption through service. He was asking to be part of something larger than himself, something that existed to nourish and heal rather than dominate and control. He was asking to contribute without commanding. "Yes," she said simply, and she meant yes to his transformation. Yes to the possibility that men can change. Yes to the power of grace. Chapter 7. Small Revolutions. The penthouse remained, but it became less important. Vito began to structure his life around the diner instead. Not abandoning his business entirely, he was still a businessman, still made decisions about money and territory, but no longer allowing it to be his entire world, his only source of meaning or identity. Isabella started working at the diner too, not out of obligation, but out of choice. She served customers and learned to look people in the eye. She made friends. Real friends, people who knew nothing of her father's empire, who valued her simply for who she was. She took a hostess position that became assistant manager within months. She went to community college, then transferred to a 4-year university, studying psychology with the intention of helping people the way she had been helped. The transformation was quiet. No dramatic speeches, no sudden enlightenment, just small choices, day after day. Vito ordering salad instead of demanding steak. Isabella finishing a full meal without spiraling into panic about calories or weight or control. Vito choosing conversation over revenge. Isabella choosing the future over fear. The city changed around them, but they noticed it less and less. The empire contracted slightly. Some of Vito's rivals moved in, claimed territory that had once been his. But he found that losing half his power didn't diminish him. It expanded him. It gave him room to breathe that he hadn't known he was suffocating without. He started waking earlier. He started noticing things. The way the sunrise looked different from the diner than it did from the penthouse. The way customers came in broken and left slightly less broken. The way serving food to people was entirely different from controlling them. One evening, Sarah found Vito crying in the diner's kitchen. Not sadness, release. Years of tension leaving his body like water from a broken dam, like a wound finally allowed to drain and heal. The sound was almost unrecognizable, a man who had trained himself never to cry, discovering that tears were not weakness, but passage from oneself to another. "What's wrong?" she asked gently, touching his shoulder. "Nothing's wrong," he said, wiping his eyes. "That's what terrifies me. For the first time in my life, nothing is wrong. And I don't know who I am without crisis. I don't know how to be a person. I only know how to be a power." Sarah sat with him on the kitchen floor, right there beside the dishwasher and the prep station. And she said, "You're a father who loves his daughter enough to become someone new. That's who you are. That's enough." Isabella was gaining weight now. Her clothes fit differently. Her voice was stronger. She had enrolled in a university, something Vito had once assumed was impossible for her, given his world. But she had proven him wrong. She had proved to herself that she could exist outside his shadow. The men in Vito's organization didn't understand the transformation. They saw their boss washing dishes in a diner, saw him refuse violence, saw him prioritize his daughter's life over territorial expansion. "He's gone soft," they muttered to each other, shaking their heads as if softness was a disease, as if compassion was contagion. But they were wrong. Vito was harder now, in a different way. He was harder against his own impulses, harder against cruelty, harder against the ease of violence. Becoming gentle, he discovered, required more strength than being ruthless ever had. It required constant vigilance. It required choosing, every single day, to be better than the man he had been. Chapter 8. The Final Wait. One evening, 6 months into his transformation, Vito received news that shattered everything he had been rebuilding. His old business partner, a man named Carmine, who had been with him since the beginning, who had shared every crime, every betrayal, every moral compromise, was dying. Cancer, the kind that moves quickly, that doesn't offer negotiations or opportunities for redemption. 3 months, maybe less. The doctors offered statistics the way priests offer last rites, and Carmine had asked to see him. Not demanded, asked. Vito sat in a hospital room on a Wednesday afternoon, watching the man who had once been his closest confidant waste away in the same manner that Isabella had wasted away. The body slowly surrendering to forces beyond its control, the spirit evident in the eyes, still carrying intelligence, but beginning to dim. The irony was painful. The symmetry was devastating. "I'm dying," Carmine said bluntly, his voice hoarse from the oxygen tubes. "And I realized I've never actually lived. I have money, I have power, I have nothing else. No one is going to come to my funeral except people who are afraid. No one is going to remember me except with fear. That's not a life, that's just a shadow." Vito felt the weight of 30 years settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. How many people had he hurt? How many lives had his pursuit of empire damaged? He thought of Isabella, so close to disappearing forever. He thought of all the other Isabellas in the city, children of men like him, raised in fear and taught that love means control. "I'm sorry," Vito said, the words inadequate but necessary. "Don't be sorry to me," Carmine replied. "Be different than I was. You still have time." Vito left the hospital and walked through the rain. It was always raining, he had noticed, in the moments that changed people. And he went directly to the diner. Sarah was there, closing up. Isabella was there, helping to wipe down tables. They were moving around each other with the ease of people who had learned to function as a team. When they saw Vito's face, they knew that something had shifted, not backward, but deeper. He was colliding with his own mortality, his own responsibility, the final weight that comes from understanding that time is limited and cannot be purchased or controlled. He gathered them both, and he said something he had never said before, something that required more courage than any business decision he had ever made. "I'm sorry for everything, for raising you in a world of fear, for making you believe that love means control, for nearly losing you to the weight of my ambitions. I'm sorry, and I know sorry doesn't undo anything. But I want you to know that every day from now on, I'm going to try to be someone better, someone worthy of forgiveness." Isabella held her father while he wept. And in that moment, in the small diner with the rain against the windows and the hum of the neon sign outside and the smell of coffee lingering in the air, something was forgiven. Not forgotten, but forgiven. The difference between those two things is the difference between freedom and the past, the ability to move forward while acknowledging what came before. Sarah stood witness to this moment, understanding that she had been part of something sacred, part of the ordinary miracles that happen when one person chooses to see another person with compassion. Chapter 9. Epilogue. The Grave. 1 year later, Vito stood in the cemetery on a clear autumn morning. The rain had stopped. The sky was grey but not threatening. The grass was wet with dew, and the air carried that specific scent of earth and endings that only comes in fall. He stood before two graves. The first was his wife, Isabella's mother, who had died 15 years earlier when Isabella was still a child. Vito had never properly grieved her. He had simply buried his pain beneath work and control, building an empire to avoid feeling anything. Now he stood before her grave and allowed himself finally to miss her. The second grave was Carmine's, his old partner who had finally let go, who had stopped fighting the current, who had given Vito his final gift, the gift of a warning spoken in time. "I understand now," Vito said quietly to the graves, his voice carrying the weight of all he had learned and all he still carried. "What I never understood before, that love isn't about power. It isn't about control. It's about letting people be exactly who they are. It's about forgiving them for being human. It's about being forgiven yourself." He placed roses on both graves, the same roses that Sarah had taught him to arrange, small gestures of care that require attention and intention, but never command. He had learned that care is the opposite of control, that attention is not the same as dominance, that love is the most powerful force in the universe precisely because it is voluntary. Behind him, Isabella placed her own flowers. She was 23 now, healthy, enrolled in a graduate program in psychology, determined to help people the way Sarah had helped her father help her. She had plans to open a support group for people struggling with eating disorders, for young people trying to escape the gravity of their parents' worlds. And standing slightly apart, watching this moment with the kind eyes that had seen so much suffering transformed into grace, was Sarah. Later that day, back at the diner, which had become as much Vito's home as the penthouse ever was, Vito asked if Sarah would become his wife. Not with diamonds or demands or any of the language of empire, not as a business transaction or a power move, simply, "Would you stay with me? I want to build something real, something that matters, something that nourishes instead of destroys. I want to make you happy, and I want to spend my life learning how to do that without demanding it, without commanding it." Sarah said yes, and Vito understood finally what the greatest power truly was, the ability to choose connection over control, to choose vulnerability over dominance, to choose love over fear, the ability to let go of everything he had built in order to build something real. The diner thrived. The empire contracted but didn't collapse. Isabella recovered completely and became an advocate for eating disorder recovery. And every morning, before opening the doors, Vito walked through the empty diner and remembered the weight of hunger. Not just the kind that comes from refusing food, but the deeper hunger that comes from refusing to truly live. The hunger that comes from choosing power over presence, dominance over love. The weight was gone now, and what remained was lighter, stronger, real. In the small booth in the back corner where he had once sat alone, nursing cold coffee and watching his life disappear, Vito now sat with Isabella and Sarah on Sunday mornings. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The silence was full of presence. It was full of recognition. It was full of the ordinary miracle of family, not family built on empire or fear or control, but family built on the choice to stay, to witness, to love. And somewhere in the city, other broken people were discovering the diner. Other people were sitting in corners, nursing cold coffee, wondering if anything could change. And Vito, recognizing himself in their faces, would bring them soup. Subscribe for more stories of loyalty, forgiveness, and redemption. Thank you for watching the case of Mafia boss's anorexic daughter refused food. Waitress did something that transformed him forever. See you in the next one.